honored to have our first speaker here today. I'm not going to tell you who he is, but I think you know who he is. You all know who he is. Frank, go ahead.
Thanks. And thanks, Alison and Justin, for a very good resume of what the issues are here. I want to draw everyone's attention to a new book. I don't know if you know this one, Alison, but it's a new book written by a man called Drew Rook, who's a young journalist, and it really is a ripping yarn about the problems of the gambling industry. It's called One Last Spin. So if anyone wants to have a look at it, I invited Drew along tonight in case he wanted to peddle his own products, but since he's not here, I thought I'd draw your attention to it anyway. It really is a ripper. He's speaking. Okay, good. Talk at Glee Books. My question is a simple one. It's although I suspect it's complicated in answer. The class dimension of this. I mean, you hear politics in the pub. The audience here is used to talking about socialism and left and right. Is there a class dimension to this issue? I mean, we know people from all walks of life gamble. It's across genders, across wealthy and poor people are involved. But there are big interests involved, as you've said, big money. To what extent is that a sort of a multinational capital that's calling the shots? And to what extent is there a potential for a sort of a more class-based response to this? In other words, not just dealing with problem gambling, which, as you say, Alison, is a very personalised way of constructing the issue, but thinking of it more broadly in terms of the politics and economics of the industry. Is there any traction there for sort of linking it into a vigorous class politics?
That's a really multi-layered question there. I guess a couple of things is, yeah, in terms of the big picture, there's a lot of, you're right, it can happen to anyone. It doesn't necessarily just happen to someone who might be of a particular socioeconomic kind of situation. But what we do know is that, for example, I mean, you're not going to find many poker machines in Wallara compared to Fairfield. So, you know, I think the number of poker machines in Fairfield is well over 3,300 and Wallara has 118. So there's that. There's also this kind of structure that we have at the moment in terms of, I think one of the biggest power structures that the club have at the moment is actually in relation to that taxation system. So it gives them great money and leverage to be able to use that money for greater political power. If you look at, for example, the tax revenue in Victoria, so Victoria, you have $2.6 billion in tax revenue in Victoria. And the taxation on that is 1.1 billion. So that's an effective tax rate of around 42%. If you look in New South Wales, you know, we've got tax revenue on 6.3 billion is 1.6 billion. So effective tax rate of around 25%. So there's all of these systems and structures that kind of keep that there. I think too, like when we talk about the class system, etc., they do target certain areas and hold themselves up, these clubs, as being working class. So that, you know, anyone who is working class can go and they can get a cheap meal and they can, you know, all of that kind of thing. So they're actually targeting, in a lot of cases, those people that would want to go to the club for connection and socialisation and a cheap meal. But obviously that's broken because a lot of that doesn't really happen. Did that answer your question?
Look, I'll probably put I think that there's a lot in that, Frank, to be honest. A couple of things that stand out. It's not just the numbers of machines, and I mean, we've done a little bit of that analysis of where the machines are. Your Fairfield's the largest, Canterbury-Bankstown is next. Look, Western Sydney is a hotspot, but interestingly, some of the coastal regional communities, retirement primarily, where there's a high retirement population, that aren't necessarily socioeconomically disadvantaged as Western Sydney might be generally, if you want to generalise based on sort of average socioeconomic indicators out there, but they are real hotspots as well. So it is a bit more complex than that. It has to do with, I think, access to a whole range of other alternatives for how people spend the time and socialise and engage. Some of the clubs the clubs are also palatial. Like, I think there's something in this, right? These are designed to be escapes. If you go to Fairfield, and I had this experience, it was really bizarre to arrive in Fairfield. We're doing a forum, Alison and I were doing a forum out there, and I went into the Fairfield RSL. And it sort of looks like a five-star Balinese resort entry with a sort of, it's like, no, it's so bizarre. It is bizarre with these water features and this sort of entry road with palms, and like Fairfield has almost no green space in sort of the city centre. It's concrete, it's square, it's hot. It was really hot. And then there's just this oasis. It is clear, and you go in, and the concierge are dressed like what you would imagine. Sorry, what was that?
The concierge, the word even. Yeah.
Well, yes, that's right. The way that person is described, but also acts and dresses, it was bizarre because it sort of reminded you what you would imagine in sort of 20th century India, where the British colonial hotels, the Indian staff would be dressed like that with the huge military style flowery uniforms with shoulder pieces and everything. You know, it's bizarre. It is designed to make you feel like you are on holiday when you're not on holiday. So there is something in that around. This is an opportunity that they are creating, a place for people to get away from their lives. There's something in that. I haven't quite worked out exactly how you use that experience and those facts around how the industry designs itself to attract members, and there's loss leading with food as well, which is a whole part of this, and that's linked, of course, to people's means and cost of living and class. Ultimately, I haven't worked out the second part of your question, Frank. Though, is what does that mean for how we engage in change? I'm not sure, and the reason, and I learnt this at Fairfield as well, the reason that's really hard, and it's really hard for me, I've got to say, for the person that I am and where I come from, so the culturally and linguistically diverse communities are overrepresented often as well. It's hard for me to have that conversation, and shame is so much linked to gambling addiction that being able to engage deeply in those communities, particularly as an outsider, even when you're in those communities, I've seen the challenges that come with that. So there's class, and there's ethnic background, and there's shame, and there's family history, and there's community expectations, and there's the fact that these clubs are seen to be these untouchable, wonderful, lovely places that we all love for whatever reason. It is so complex, but class is right somewhere spread through all of that.
If I could just comment, I came from the anti-tobacco campaigns, and I went from treatment to prevention, and I think that's very important, and then from looking at prevention in a medical sense to prevention in a social policy sense, and I think that's where we're at here. The key issue in the success of the anti-tobacco campaign was identifying an enemy, and that was the tobacco industry and its vectors, which were the club and pub lobby, which were very important in maintaining their power within the political parties as they existed nationally. So I think we have to identify industries, and we have to say that the Australian gambling lobby is the equivalent of the American arms lobby, and effectively exists in isolation here with norms that are completely out of touch with the rest of the world, but in the same way that the American arms industry is out of touch with the rest of the world in their guns over there. So we have to frame it as a thing created by this gambling industry. We then have to get some research, because of course they control the funding of the research, and so there isn't any research, as Justin pointed out. So, and then I think in the end we'll have to run a campaign directed totally at the industry and regarding everybody who helps it as their lackey. Just as the Winfield Cup supported lung cancer, and the government and the rugby league got in there, and the pubs and clubs got in there. So that's the way the gambling industry works, and I believe until it's targeted in that focused manner, and then I think we have to, in order to juxtapose good against evil, we sprayed on billboards and got arrested. I think people have to put coins in the machines with super glue on them, stuff up a pub's worth of machines and piss off, and then when they go to jail and say, oh, well, I don't really care, I haven't any money anyway, it'll be free food for a couple of weeks, people will go, shit, look what's happening. And I mean, it sounds terrible to say all this here. I suppose one could say I'm, what are you saying? Advocating felony, creating conspiracies. Is this? Have I created a criminal conspiracy? Is there any lawyers about? I mean, but I'm getting there. If I just a few more words, I'll hang myself. But this, I think we have to juxtapose good and evil. And then the question I'd ask you is the current political system capable of changing against that tsunami of money? It doesn't seem to be in America. Do we have to go to a Swiss system where we do everything by plebiscites and we don't have the political parties anymore? But
Well
we
said.
need. Thanks.
That was Arthur Chesterfield Evans, if you want to in touch with him later.
It was a bit of a comment, but you know, I agree. There's definitely you can make that comparison. It has been made very recently. You know, there's been public commentary to that effect, and it looks like it in a lot of ways. But interestingly, the public support for change is really strong. We've seen it's not as polarised, this issue, as guns are in the US. It's not along partisan lines either, to be honest. So I think there is more opportunity for change here, but how do you mobilise the people who instinctively support getting, you know, they think having poker machines on every street corner is ridiculous, but mobilising that to change people's votes, making politicians ultimately scared about it, getting parties to recognise the social community benefits from starting to wind back these machines. Clearly, Tasmanian Labor did it for a reason. There's been no end of politicians in Australia who have created fantastic personal legacies going after the gambling industry as well. You don't get pilloried, you get sort of, you know, you do by the industry, but the public sort of love you. So we've got a slightly different context. There's opportunities there. So I don't disagree with what you're saying. I don't even mind if people go out and do what you said. That sounds like an eminently sensible idea in some instances. But I think there is there's definitely a pathway for change here. We got to find out how to join all those things up.
I'd agree with all of that. I think that the other slight difference here is when we're trying to find the enemy in New South Wales, the biggest enemy or the biggest barrier to reform is actually clubs. It's not pubs. And so the challenge with that is that they are currently seen as the good guys. So we have to challenge that notion that they are the good guys. So for example, you know, we lost our family home and our family business. They built a motel, but they sponsored our local netball team and I got a netball bib as compensation for all of that. We need to start giving that perspective. So when they start talking about what they're giving the community, it's like, this is a really bad deal and it's a con. The second thing... Yeah, well, that is the industry in New South Wales. That's the biggest. Clubs New South Wales is the most, yeah. Yeah. So the other thing I would say in terms of what the parallels with tobacco, which we haven't had yet, there are lots of parallels with research. There are industry paid researchers at the moment that focus on the gambler rather than the product. We've got that. But what I would also say is one of the biggest shifts that came in tobacco was when they started talking about harm to others and passive smoking. So that's something I think is a real opportunity as well. And so the third thing is like just on your point around the public support. So the public support, we know, like we constantly get surveys and polls that say to 70 to 80% of people support reform. What that is though is actually kind of a passive support. So if you ask someone, do I support poker machine reform? They go yes. But it's how do we turn that into active support and start putting pressure on these politicians and turning up in their offices, ringing them up, you know, doing all of that sort of stuff to say, I actually care about this issue, and we change it from a passive support to an active one.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for your informative talk. I just want to put it in a general sort of cultural context. Okay, in casino capitalism, the economist Susan Strange argues that the winning and losing of vast fortunes on the stock exchange is nothing as much as a vast casino. A casino where the dice are loaded in favour of the bankers and the ultra-rich. A system of winners and losers. A system that destroys people and is essentially unproductive. Ultimately, she compares poker machines as an emblem of perfect capitalism, selling the lie that everyone can win, a mug's game for the 99%, while the 1% clean up. And goes on to say that the growth of the gambling industry feeds on job insecurity, the growth of the precariat. People, whether gambling or seeking employment, have fewer viable ways to make a living. And so what is the difference between gambling on the pokies and this new casino capitalism? That's my question. The pervasive overall culture, the way the banks operate.
Well, probably not a lot in reality. That's a great philosophical question, one we could chew over. But as far as, I'm not sure if you're trying to make the connection there that ultimately the poker machines are a function of the capitalist system at the moment. Obviously, the profitability of those machines drives so much of the economic drive of the clubs. They're becoming behemoths in our communities. They're empire building, and they're protected by their special status as not-for-profit entities, and the ability for them to deliver through grants and taxation means they're protected in terms of our political system. And all of that has over the top of it, this neoliberal capitalist worldview, and also, I guess underpinning that is that's the public. I mean, we've raised money for great public services through lotteries. Some of our great bits of social infrastructure came out of lotteries. There are ways to employ that sort of people probably are free to go and gamble if they want. That's the argument largely put by clubs. But there are ways to cultivate that in a more productive way. The key point is that it is totally unproductive, or it services a very, very narrow interest and a very, very capitalist-driven interest, and against the public interest. We could tap that in an entirely different way. That doesn't get away from the harm, though, that this causes, which is much, much greater. And ultimately, everyone loses, other than the industry here. It is not the case that anyone who if you keep gambling on these machines, you will lose, which is, I think, quite a unique part of this particular problem. But that's a wonderful philosophical question to have afterwards. That bigger one.
Like a microcosm of the system
With a
as
few
a
beers.
whole. Okay.
Thank
Your
you,
name?
Joffrey Balcher. Thank you, Alison and Justin. I want to look at I want to pursue Frank's question of the class dimension. And I think it has to do with the commercialized nature of electoral politics. Who puts money in gets the votes, normally. And so what we have here in the gambling industry is a natural outcome of the commercialized nature of electoral politics. So where's the class structure here? One is, it tends to, for the lower classes, it fosters the bread and circuses. But also, we haven't talked about it on a more sinister aspect, that gambling can also be a means of laundering money. And I'm aware of that, in a sense that there could be syndicates waiting in the wings saying, okay, you bet $1 million. What do you call it? If you bet, we can make you win to justify your illegal income, as long as we get commissions on the side. And I find this risk we have to address, considering that I think Australia's trying to retain its place in gambling in the world. You've mentioned, Alison, that we're number 2. Number 1 is we're number 1. You mean we've overtaken Macau, even?
We are number 1 in the world in terms of...
Oh my goodness. But then, you know that in many third world countries, gambling casinos are a means of laundering money.
Yes.
And so, what safeguards have we have we made to ensure that that doesn't happen on the higher crust of society? Because that can happen. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, we have had lots of report. I mean, there's lots of industry conduct that is a bit beyond the pale, actually, and some people are actually starting to blow the whistle quite a bit on that. So there have been instances of money laundering. There also have been, so for example, you know, recently someone blew the whistle on Woolworths that they were specifically targeting people who were grieving a loved one. You know, giving them free meals and drinks and making them feel right at home. Crown Casino, it's alleged that they've been providing picks to put into machines so that people can play one machine more than one machine at once. So there are these things, and I think increasingly as we go along and people start to go, that's just not okay, we will see more kind of whistleblowers and things like that. Yeah.
In Fairfield, the average annual income, if you compare the amount of money that goes through the machines in Fairfield with the average annual income, the per person amount that ultimately goes through those machines is higher than the average annual income. So that does not make any sense. That's not how much people lose, that's how much people put through. So clearly there is other money coming into that system. Like that, so that is got to be the case. But to that bigger political question, with some of the strongest donation laws in New South Wales, this money isn't actually coming directly to our politicians on a very big scale. But it is going federally in the tune of millions. That's very clear. Although...
Sorry, I just have to make this point. So, and I like to make this point because Mike Baird made a big song and dance about, you know, political donations reform and saying that gambling entities were banned from making donations. Clubs are exempt from that ban as not-for-profit organisations. So I just like to make that point.
One more very quick. We debated this legislation in the Parliament at 3 o'clock last night. I moved legislation to make not-for-profit gambling clubs prohibited donors in New South Wales, and the Labor Party and the government opposed it.
Thank you, Paul Butler. I worked a number of years ago. I worked as a technocrat for government for a period, and when brought a problem of public policy, always used to look overseas or look interstate, but not in this case, but look overseas to see how other jurisdictions had tackled that particular problem, and to look at the best examples then of those who had successfully tackled the problem. Now, I understand from your stats that Australia is now looking the worst in this particular respect, which means either we've gotten worse or others have succeeded in tackling their problem. And so I wondered if in your research, Productivity Commission and so on, if your research, you'd had a look overseas to see are there examples of other countries or states successfully tackling this problem, and the implications for your work?
It's a really tough question to ask because that was the problem around. There is no jurisdiction quite like Australia. We don't have. There are not other jurisdictions that have poker machines in every, you know, pub and club, apart from this one. Yay. But you know, it's a very difficult one. And then when there were kind of measures that were done internationally, some of them were not comparable. So it's actually a big argument by the industry to say your reform agenda isn't evidence-based because you can't point to somewhere else in the world where it's been done. And that's not to say we shouldn't actually address it here. So, you know, we're the world leaders in harm, we can be the world leaders in reform. Yeah.
Apples and oranges, eh?
Anthony Lewis, I'd just like to say I've been there, all right? Luckily, my analytical mind overcame the enticing nature. I'm actually, you know, I'm a professional engineer, single person. I've got a quite a high, you know, individual income, and I lost 2,000 to 5,000. Who knows exactly how much? But it makes me angry. But don't get angry, get active, and don't get anxious or paranoid. Get active, and so I live in Western Sydney for people who don't know, and I look at two places. I look at the Rudy Hill RSL and the St Mary's Band Club, that both of them are not actually associated with these clubs, and they're both making fortunes. All right, the Rudy Hill RSL has put on ice skating rink. Just so you know, we've got an ice skating rink there. We've got a gymnasium. We've got a swimming pool. We've got a hotel now, you know, and it's between Rudy Hill and Mount Druitt. It's just in the middle of nowhere. It's a monolith, just creating its own space. And every time I go to an RSL, I go look for the army facility. You know, like the respect to the returned servicemen. You know, I just do that. Just Anyway, I'll move to that. So my question comes back to how do we take action directly? You know, I actually think the first one might be any club that has a poker machine is no longer a not-for-profit organisation. It's just a simple one, and I think that you would get incredible. Just separate that from everything else. Start with that. That would. But I'm not going to give you solutions. I want to ask questions. Okay. What are the actions we can take? And the Blacktown Greens, which I'm a member of, are really keen to act on this.
Good.
You should join our Champions for Change program. No, I'm serious. So I feel really passionately about this, that those of us who have been impacted by this and have the passion that you have so profoundly, that we really do have an active role and are able to do things that we think are meaningful. I completely agree with you. If you've got poker machines, you're not a not-for-profit. Sorry, that tax status should be gone. So there are a number of things that we do, and we have Champions for Change where we train and support people who really want to get active and involved, and those people with a lived experience to do things in a way that's meaningful for them, because I think we need to have that respect and that ability to do something meaningful. So whether it be lobbying politicians directly, doing media, starting campaigns like the one you just described, you know, things like that, definitely. Yeah.
Just very quickly, Anthony, I'm ex-Army myself, so I've spent a bit of time in RSLs. I was in the Army in Western Australia, and the RSL in Western Australia, they genuinely are return servicemen facilities. You know, they get together, they interact with each other meaningfully in a small environment. It's about friendship and connection in their community. They don't have poker machines in WA. Poker machines are restricted to casinos. Anyone that tells you need to have casinos to have clubs or to have profitable pubs is just lying, because they're all over Western Australia, and they provide courtesy buses to get home, and they have bowling greens, and they associated with sports clubs. So it's just nonsense. There's clearly other ways to do it. I think showing those models to people, showing that there's another pathway to doing this that's more connected, more community, more about meeting the needs of people in the local area. I think one of the keys as well is getting the local businesses on side, because, as you know, at Rudy Hill, it's just hollowed out the other businesses, the small businesses. They get absolutely gutted by these big behemoths that are just building empires in communities.
So, a lot of noise was made about how the Star Casino is directly outside of our lockout zone. But I think something much more outrageous is that just a couple doors down from here, for example, the Aurora Hotel towards Surrey Hills, is also exempt from the lockout laws. So the problem runs much deeper than we thought. Obviously, the gambling lobby has a very strong foothold in the way the lockouts were designed. How was this, and how is it that Australia and New South Wales in particular is so uniquely prone to the gambling industry just completely taking our entire nightlife in the grip of their hand and designing like something like the lockout laws for their financial benefit?
It is an interesting question. I'm not sure I actually have the answer for that. It's absolutely clear the disproportionate level of influence that both Star and Crown have over public policy and governments. Straight up and down, that is because of that revolving door. You got senior players from the Labor and Liberal Party that have made their way onto the boards and various committees of the major gambling entities in this country. And so it's those relationships that ultimately make sure that when there's policy change coming, that they're able to carve out exemptions. But the lockout laws were more complicated than that, I think. And so I'm not sure that I can give a totally coherent answer that addresses your question directly. But certainly the casinos just get including having smoking being allowed in certain casino areas, just exempted from most basic laws. It's outrageous.
Last question.
When I came to Australia, pubs closed at 10 o'clock. They did not have poker machines, yet anybody running a pub could not go wrong. He was running, he was...
Rivers of cash.
Yeah, swimming in cash. Since then, pubs have been allowed to stay open much longer. They've been allowed to have poker machines, yet I've seen pubs close. Yeah. Can anyone explain that?
This is a really interesting one because I think, so we've got the situation in WA, for example, where there are no poker machines in clubs and pubs at all. So what you've actually got then is a level playing field among all hospitality, basically, because they're not actually getting revenue from poker machines. The other thing, so what it's done is kind of created this situation where you've got pokies clubs competing with pokies pubs and things like that, right? So you're just creating another field, but you've also got, like Justin said, you've got other businesses actually closing down around them as well. So to me, it's like, and I also think if I go into a lot of clubs and pubs that have poker machines and quite a lot of revenue from it, it's appalling customer service. They haven't diversified at all and they become quite lazy about revenue, and that's why I think a lot of those businesses close. But some interesting stats. So here's the thing of the impact of introduction of poker machines, and goes to your point about pubs and clubs closing down and things like that. So in Tasmania, they did a social and economic impact study, and after the introduction of poker machines, they found a 14% decline in employment in pubs in the 3 years after the pokies were introduced. And they also found that for every dollar lost on pokies, 65 cents was lost for competing businesses. So this is where poker machines can actually create an environment of unrealistic and unfair competition, and they start closing down.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to put your hands together to thank our speakers for a very informative and educational hour or so. Next week, we have the topic will be, oh boy, a little bit late, but the 30th poll, a Turnbull deadline or a media sideshow. Yes, you're all welcome. And one of the speakers is Guy Rundle from Crikey. I'm not sure who the other speaker is, but we'll try and find out if there is one. If not, I'm sure it'll be a good evening.
It's the only one, I think.
The only one. Do you want to say that? Well done.
It'll be a general discussion of Australian politics.
Yeah. Looking forward to it. Once more, thanks for coming. Good luck.